Thank you for that introduction. Hear these words from Acts chapter 9, verses 36 through 42. I will be reading from a woman's lectionary for the whole church, Year B, by Reverend Dr. Will Gaffney. Now in Joppa there was a disciple whose name was Tabitha, which translated into Greek is Dorcas. She was abundant in good works and benevolent giving. And it happened that at the time she became ill and died, they washed her and laid her in a room upstairs. Now Lydda was near Joppa, so the disciples who heard that Peter was there sent 2 people to him, urging, "Without delay, come to us." Then Peter got up and went with them. When he arrived, he took them to the room upstairs, and standing beside him were all the widows, weeping and displaying the tunics and other clothing that Dorcas made while she was with them. Then Peter put all of them inside and got on his knees and prayed and turned to the body and said, "Tabitha, arise." And she opened her eyes, and seeing Peter, she sat up. Then he gave her his hand and raised her up, and calling the saints and the widows, he presented her alive. Now this became known throughout Joppa, and many believed in the Messiah. The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. So how are you, church? It's a bit of an annoying question, isn't it? How are you? How often do we actually answer honestly when we're asked that? I know I never know how to respond, how honest to be, how much the person posing the question wants to hear, how much I want to hear when I'm the one posing the question. What do we really mean when we ask, "How are you?" John Wesley often opened up small group gatherings by asking, "How is it with your soul?" And I like this version of "How are you?" a little more. The question itself, this kind of soul tending, requires more than a simplistic answer like the fine or busy we might have offered instead. It's really hard to lie to ourselves or others when we're asked a question like this. It calls for an honest assessment of where we are and perhaps even who we are. And then it calls for us to share that reality with others, in the hope that maybe, at bare minimum, we might get to ask them the same thing and live into that vulnerability together. I think if we're honest with ourselves, we crave that kind of connection. As I reflected on this topic, answering the call for human thriving, everything I put on these pages seemed trite. Every idea seemed more akin to what you might find in the decoration aisle of a Hobby Lobby, next to the signs that say "Live, Laugh, Love," or "It's fall, y'all," than an actual answer to the call for human thriving. I confess, it is hard for me to imagine a humanity that thrives when our world is full of such death, destruction, and dehumanization. The deaths of our Palestinian and Jewish siblings, a never-ending war in Ukraine, the destruction of trans-affirming spaces, people are drowning in hospital bills for receiving the care they need to live. The ruthless dehumanization of Black and brown people, voter suppression is at an all-time high. Affordable housing is rapidly disappearing. Food prices are skyrocketing. There's a humanitarian crisis in Ethiopia, if you didn't know. The ethnic cleansing of Armenians is, the news is not addressing. The world is on fire. The list is endless, and we are barely surviving. Forgive me if it's hard to look at the state of our world and see a place for thriving. Have humans ever truly thrived? Have we ever flourished collectively? How can we, when every day calls for another vigil to attend, another body to bury, more cause to grieve? The story of Tabitha looks out on a world not so very different from ours. We find ourselves amongst the most marginalized in that world, a grieving community of widows, women who have no home, no claim, no hope. And their minister and matriarch, Tabitha, has suddenly died. So they take action in the ways only friends who feel like family can. They plan a funeral, make the food, don the clothes and the gifts that remind them of their dearly departed, and call for the closest, most admired spiritual leader they can think of, Peter, to pay homage to their friend and mentor one last time. Did they want Peter to know about Tabitha's extraordinary ministry? Did they wish for him to honor a pillar of their community, the woman who saw them when no one else would? Did they quietly hope for a miracle beyond miracles, for a reprieve from death? The scene I imagine upon Peter's arrival looks like every Southern funeral I've ever attended. Women from every generation fretting over the food, welcoming mourners as they come and go, consoling each other, tending to Tabitha's body, asking always, whether aloud or in silence, how is it with your soul? I'd almost worry about these grandmas and mamas and aunties, except because they're caring for everyone, everyone is cared for. And they do it not because it assuages their own grief, but because it is what you do for the people you love in times of loss. You fill the fridge, do the laundry, buy the groceries, relentlessly tend to the soul until the people who are grieving hardest can stand on their own 2 feet. This community of widows had no one to mourn for them, so they mourned each other. Their community grew where none should have existed. These women sustain each other, a church unto themselves. These are Tabitha's mourners, her legacy. And I imagine Apostle Peter arriving on the scene to these women, these professional mourners, flocking to him, earnestly trying to help him see how they have cared for Tabitha's body and adorned their own in Tabitha's woven creations, as though to say, look at how she cared for her bodies, look at how she cared for our souls. And I imagine Peter walking into a room full of women laughing, crying, laughing till they cry, crying till they laugh, propping each other up through it all. And I imagine, I hope, Peter saw this and thought, this is what it means to thrive. These widows, our professional mourners, might be onto something. Even as some of the most marginalized, least protected members of society, they present a hopeful kind of grace, the kind one can only exude in moments of deep pain and oppression. They emphasize the important work of communal healing, denouncing the instinct to be private with our pain. Even in death, Tabitha has made this community of widows into role models for the kinds of relationships we should be holding. Some of you know this, but for those of you who don't, about 9 months ago, I had a debilitating case of vertigo that lasted a week and ended in an overnight stay at the hospital. When it became apparent that I would not be getting over this spell on my own, and with no biological family nearby, my parents, who live in Alabama, had just been exposed to COVID, I turned to the family I have here at Brite. Ryan Galloway drove me to the doc in the box, and when that doctor sent me to the ER, the TCU chaplain, Lee McCracken, practically carried me into the hospital and filled out the paperwork I couldn't see. Monica Bradley talked my COVID-infected mother down from a trip here, saying, "We've got her." Dr. Fluker notified my professors because, though I couldn't see straight, I was still very concerned about missing class. Priorities. And then she sat with me until I was moved to the overnight ward. Deb Welch and Kim Starkey used their lunch break to visit me, waited around for me to be discharged, took me to pick up my prescriptions before walking me into my apartment at Librock. Kyle Fauntleroy called to check in on me for weeks after I was discharged. Professors and peers alike emailed or texted offering prayers, asking to buy me groceries or to help out with my medical bills. Through the disorientation, literally and figuratively, these people, my people, came alongside me, steadying my path. I have 1,000 stories like this from the last year and a half, but it took a trip to the hospital for me to see, to really reckon with what it might look like, what it might mean to be a community of widows. This, my friends, is what community is. It is the collective experiences of our lives, sharing an authentic celebration, promising to not be private with our pain, to live into vulnerability together. It's asking, who do you want to celebrate with? Who do you long for in times of grief? Who holds your anxiety with you? Who will curse at God with you? Who will curse at God when you can no longer? Who will ask you, not how are you, but how is it with your soul? Our grief, our pain, our joy, our laughter, our collective suffering calls us together. It calls us to gather and hope for new and renewed life. Tabitha's story is one that I have read 1,000 times, but it is the community that has encircled me here, which has taught me that the power of this story does not simply lie in Tabitha's resurrection. Rather, it is within the community which was revived in her absence. Elizabeth Berg says, "The only good thing about sorrow is that it brings us down to ground zero inside of ourselves. It reacquaints us with our best and truest self, and it releases compassion like some mighty hormone. And if there is one good thing for us, it is to have compassion, because it brings us together." The reason that our community of widows felt Tabitha's death so deeply is because they lived so fully together. It is through Tabitha's ministry that this community of widowers do more. They do more than simply survive, but truly thrive. So at the end of her life, they promised to mourn and honor her by standing vigil at her grave, remembering and reminding others of her crest, a testament to her selfless bravery and compassion. A reminder that when one of us dies, a piece of the whole dies. Like these women clung to the fabric woven by their departed beloved, we should cling to each other in times of grief and suffering and joy and hopefulness. We cannot survive, much less thrive, without each other. It is the spirit of Tabitha, the spirit of her community of widowers, that we hope will take up residence within us. I cannot flourish without you. You cannot flourish without me. You and I, we need each other. We bring love to one another. We are built, created to be in community. We were made in the image of a divine being that desires and longs for relationships, and thus, we are designed to desire the same. If somebody asks the question, then somebody has to answer. In that interaction, a relationship must be formed. Reciprocity is demanded. To thrive does not mean to simply live a happy life. It means to be in relationships that are life itself. To be with people who will wade through the debris of grief and keep asking, how is it with your soul? So I ask you, Deb, I ask you, Monica, I ask you, Aaron and Annie and Jonathan, all of you, my community of widows. How is it with your soul?